again, everybody. Once again, we are going to try to take something extremely complicated today and make it into something much more manageable. Terrorism, this concept of terrorism, this idea of terrorism, where does it come from? Where did it start? What is it that they're ultimately after? Why does terrorism exist? That's what we're going to try to determine today, and hopefully do it as quickly as we can here. All right, so you've got access to these notes. I'm going to use some pictures as well. The first part, I wanted something really for you to look at here. First concept I want you to make sure you understand is this idea of what exactly is a terrorist. When we think terrorist, we automatically think 9/11. We think airplanes being blown up and things being hijacked and hostages being taken. The reality is you can find terrorism in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different shapes, in a lot of different forms, and it's not necessarily going to always look the same to everybody. This first quote here: "One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist." What we see as somebody around the world, just trying to gain freedom, in many ways, can be seen as a terrorist by a different organization. And we can even see it in ourselves. You go back to 1776, the British saw the Americans who were rebelling against the crown. They were terrorists to the British. To us, man, they're just freedom fighters who want liberty. The British, they're terrorists. So what we view as a terrorist is going to be different than what other people are going to view as terrorists. So we need to make sure that we keep that in mind, um, that we have this stereotypical view of what a terrorist is, but that's not necessarily always going to be the case. We, can see terrorism in our own midst. We don't like to call it that, but certainly there are extremists within our own country that would be deemed or labeled as terrorists by other peoples as well. All right, so where does it all come from? Again, I'm going to try to take something extremely complex and try to simplify it for you. I think the first thing that you really kind of have to look at here is, the creation of Israel, and we can really go back even beyond, beyond that, because we could look at, post World War I, really, because you could, as far as, why does it all start to exist? Well, you got to look at the idea of mistrust. Towards the end of World War I, the allies get together and they're trying to decide, okay, what are we going to do with the Middle East after the war is over? Aha, I know. We will create what they were calling an Arab homeland. That Arab homeland would have been basically what we call the Middle East today. The British leave that meeting and decide, man, we're really not comfortable with this. We're not sure that the war is going to go our way. We need something else to make sure that things are going to happen the way we want them to. So they got somebody within the Ottoman Empire to rise up, to rebel, to get them out of World War I, and ultimately they promised, hey, you're going to get to be the leader of this Arab homeland. He believes he's getting the entire Middle East. Once the French find out what was going on, they decide we have to renegotiate this and ultimately give him just the Arabian Peninsula, what was thought to be, at least at that time, the worst parts of that part of the world. So based on that, um, that's kind of the seeds of mistrust. That's kind of where it all begins. Hey, you promised me one thing and then ultimately did not deliver on that. That's a reason not to trust what the West says. They say you're going to do one thing, but when it comes down to it, they're going to do something completely different. And then after World War II, or at the end of World War II, you had the discovery of the Holocaust. And because of that, you see support for worldwide support for the creation of Israel. Um, That being said, well, where are you going to create it? Well, biblically, it says that it's where the country of Palestine stands at that point. The United Nations decide, okay, we're going to have to partition this. The British stuck around. They tried to, stay as long as they could to try and make things right, to try and get Palestine to a place where they could, hand it over to the people. Just didn't think that was ever going to happen peacefully. So they give it to the United Nations. They decide we're going to partition it. We're going to split it, and we're going to create two countries: one Palestine that would be Muslim, one Israel, which would be Jewish. They partition it. The Palestinians aren't happy with the way that goes, and ultimately there's going to be a war that's going to break out over it, in which most of the rest of the world is going to support Israel. Israel's going to win out on that. Another reason for the peoples of the Middle East not to trust the West. Okay, Western influence post World War II. Essentially, what you're looking at here is after World War II is over, the West is still going to keep an influence in that part of the world. Now you've got the Cold War going on, you've got communism versus democracy, and both sides are going to want to have their say. So you're going to see an American influence in Turkey, for example. You're going to see a Soviet influence in Afghanistan. We already talked about that. There's going to be these outside influences, not just the West, but outside influences who remain in that part of the world, basically trying to pull the strings, trying to operate and influence what's going on. That's going to be a reason for people in the Middle East not to like what's going on in the outside part of the world. You're trying to control us. Nobody likes to be controlled. Okay, relationships and occupation in the Middle East. Okay, we're getting more into more modern times. Saudi Arabia, for example, they went through a period where, hey, we need some outside influence. We need some protection. We need somebody to come in and help us to maintain peace, to maintain stability within our country. Uh, People like Osama bin Laden stepped up and said, hey, we should take care of ourselves. The ruling family in Saudi Arabia said, we want to bring in the United States. Having the United States have such a major influence, have military bases in what's considered to be the most holy of areas in Islam, was seen as an absolute atrocity to somebody like Osama bin Laden. Why does he become as radicalized as he does? That kind of helps explain part of that. So occupation, things like that that still go on here. He warned that, hey, if you allow the United States to come in, you allow them to, which we do during the Gulf War, come in and set up military bases and allow that to happen. Um, and allow them to stage military exercises on another Muslim country from a Muslim country, the holiest of Muslim countries. It's absolutely should not ever be allowed to happen. The Saudis are allowed that to happen. They already weren't very well liked because they're going to be one of the first ones to kind of turn their back on the rest of the Middle East and settle with Israel. So the Saudis are a place where they allow the United States to come in and have a presence. Osama bin Laden at the time said, "Hey, they're not going to leave once they get here." And as much as we don't like to admit it, he was right. We still have an influence. We still have a place in Saudi Arabia. And then you have the second invasion to go in and remove Saddam Hussein. Now you've got the United States flexing their muscle on Iraq, and not because they've invaded someplace else, but because we didn't like the reports that we were getting. That's going to be something that's going to lead a lot of people to groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS. Why? Because they don't like that the United States is coming in and trying to tell them, here's how you have to live. So there's a lot of different excuses or reasons or origins that you can come up with of why do we have the the terrorism that we see today. Where does it all come from? And we can really look at Syria as kind of a case study in all of this. We can look at them and say, okay, everything that we have been talking about, we can see it in this one country and how it all comes to be. They had been a French colony. Um, and they got to a point where, okay, we're going to go through decolonization. They go through that process, and ultimately, you have a dictator that is going to step in and start running things. A guy by the name of Al Assad, who is going to run things for the better part of 30 years as a dictator before, passing away and giving over the presidency, is what's now going to be called, to his son Bashar al-Assad. Oddly enough, when he got the call, he was actually living in Britain and training to be a dentist. Now he has to come home to Syria and be a dictator. Kind of a big change of events for him. So that's the current leader in Syria today, is this guy Bashar al-Assad. He's going to take over, and there's going to be a lot of things that he's going to have to kind of learn on the job. And the way he's going to take to that is the way that a lot of dictators would. He's going to come in and is going to use force to try and fear to keep people in line. A lot of human rights violations are going to come out of this. For example, you see in this picture, there's some writing that's been spray painted on a wall. These are anti Assad remarks. They were spray painted by a 14-year-old. Okay, a 14-year-old and some of his friends are spray painting this. There's a lot of people at the time that did not like Al Assad, that were protesting, against Al Assad. This is a clear message that you can pin on one person or a small group of people. So these 14-year-olds are going to be ultimately arrested, and they are very, very brutally tortured. Their hands were bound, they were tied, they were wet down, they were electrocuted with electrical cords up and down their sides for several hours to try and get them to name who their families were, who their brothers and sisters, their parents, their aunts, their uncles, because those were all people that were going to be seen as potential agitators and were going to be arrested and tortured as well. So this is the type of person that they're ultimately dealing with. Somebody who has no problem arresting children, torturing children, and doing all these things to their families as well to try and ultimately get their way. What does this result in? Well, you wind up having anti-Assad protests are going to grow, and it's primarily because of this period of time known as Arab Spring. We don't have the time to really go into all of that, but throughout the Middle East, you saw a lot of these dictator type governments that were changing, that were being forced out because of protests happening throughout the region. What's different here is that rather than just, hey, I'm going to make some changes to try and keep these people happy, Assad actually got groups to go in and kill people that were protesting. This is going to erupt into a civil war, and that's where we kind of see things today. We have this civil war that's going on between pro and anti-Assad forces. This gentleman right here, that is Bashar al-Assad. So you see the civil war going on, and it's going to bring in some outside influence. It's going to bring in Russia. It's going to bring in Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Turkey. All these different places are going to start picking sides in the civil war, and hey, we're going to support the side. It becomes very much like a proxy war that we've talked about. But the thing is, you've got all these different groups that are going to say, "Hey, we're supporting this group, we're fighting against this other group," and it becomes this big, huge web of interconnectedness. And ultimately, what all of this is going to do is it's going to make people within Syria. Um, hey, I like this group, I don't like this group, but ultimately, there's one group that's offering me stability, and it's going to be this group, ISIS. um, the rebel group that is going to hey, say we don't want any of this civil war. We're going to go out and we're going to create our own thing. Yes, it's going to be very very extreme, but ultimately, you know what? We're going to offer people stability. We're going to offer people peace. We're going to promise them that, hey, we're going to live with very, very strict laws, but it's going to be peaceful because we're going to make it be peaceful. So ISIS is really going to grow in size and strength and power because of all of this fighting that's going to be going on as a result of that civil war. And then you throw in the whole idea that, hey, we still have Sunni versus Shia, that having two different groups that you can pit against each other, that is still existing here. And it's going to be yet another reason why people are going to turn to extremism. So when it all comes down to it, here's what we got to figure out. Why do terrorist groups form? The possibility of change. They're going to offer people a way to change their situation. Hey, you're living in really, really bad poverty. Join our group. We can give you a quote unquote better life. We can offer you the possibility of maybe changing things instead of just staying in poverty. They're going to present the West as here's the reason for your poverty. So if we fight against this, then maybe we can change our situation. Maybe we don't like the way they live their lives, and this is a way for us to get back at that. Decolonization is going to happen all throughout the region, and it's ultimately going to lead to instability. Stable situations are going to be breeding grounds for extremism. Why? Because the extremists can come in and say, hey, without a doubt, I am going to bring about peace because I am going to offer the strict code of living, and everybody is going to have to live with it, or else. The or else is what's going to provide peace. It's going to provide stability. Yes, it might be scary, but it's going to provide stability in a place that doesn't have it. A lot of times, if you really look at how desperate people are, desperation will allow all of us to maybe make decisions we wouldn't normally make. Desperation can do really crazy things to us. And that's what you're seeing in a lot of these places. Hey, this is a way for you to improve or to stabilize